from that point of view, then I guess the question is, where do you find the type approach most useful in your work as well as in your research?
Sure. That maybe even be a difficult question for me. I do use it, but it's not really in a formalized way. In terms of my research, I
Okay.
would say really it's more of a curiosity more than it is any necessary, at least at this point, applied use. So one of my first pieces that I was doing right after, kind of even in conjunction with putting the test together, which I just call the Young Function Inventory, is looking at psychological disorders, in particular
Okay.
ADHD, and how that relates to type. Now, I know there's some danger and some kind of trepidation about talking about type with regard to mental disorders or any type of psychological differences. But for me, I really took the approach that some psychological disorders, and here I'm speaking out of my clinical expertise, is that some of these psychological differences really just are differences. And we've come to understand them as disorders because of the context of the society that we live in. But I'm thinking about things like ADHD. I'm thinking about things like autism, certainly low on the spectrum or high functioning, as they say, autism. These things that really kind of just represent differences, but given the sort of very strict society we live in, 9 to 5,
Yeah.
this type of job, what jobs usually entail, sitting down for a long period of time, right? It looks like a disorder. So for me, I started this by thinking about ADHD and how really that is just a personality difference. And the question I ask myself is there a way to capture this on something like a function scale or an MBTI? And turns out you can.
Okay.
Not entirely, but to a very large degree, you can see those differences in terms of personality from my research.
It's a really interesting line, quite a nuanced line to tread, I guess, because if I understand it rightly, what you're doing is trying to take those ways of behaving away from a clinical model,
That's right.
and saying that rather than a mental illness or a deficiency, it's just a different way of behaving, and some aspects of our personality may feed into that. Do I get that right in terms of
Absolutely right.
where you're
Yeah.
coming from with that?
Yeah. When you're studying psychological disorders, one of the first things, excuse me, that you begin to learn is that there's all these definitions, there's all these symptoms, but generally it comes down to the individual's distress, right? It's a problem if it's a problem. It's not necessarily a problem if it's not a problem. That's not
Yeah.
always the case, but if somebody's a little bit anxious sometimes, if they get stage fright or they get test anxiety or they have a little social anxiety, but they manage through, they do whatever they need to do and they can handle it. That's different than somebody who can't handle it, who can't go to work, who can't take tests, who whatever it is they can't do. And so again, we're sort of looking for the problem and not just, okay, somebody's nervous, right? We have to allow for human difference. Well, when you look
Yeah.
at something like ADHD, for instance, I'll just stick with that one. The distress comes from the society. It doesn't come from the individual not being able to tolerate their feelings or not being able to tolerate sadness or whatever it is. It comes from the pressure of, I can't keep up with what I'm expected to keep up with, right? Or my teacher keeps getting mad at me because I can't pay attention. And so that distress isn't inherent. We would say that it's syntonic, ego syntonic.
Yeah.
And so, again, that just led me down this rabbit hole of, well, if that's not really coming from a person, maybe it's just a difference. And again, can we capture that through personality?
I think it's a really interesting avenue to pursue, because one of the things we're very keen with things like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator is that people don't treat it as a diagnostic tool, don't treat it as a tool for diagnosing mental illness or other conditions. But what we do also find clearly is that society in general seems to put pressure on people to behave in certain ways, and
Mm,
those are aligned with certain types. So
that's
we
right.
know that generally speaking, not everybody, but many people, we probably a little more pressure to behave in an extroverted way,
Hmm.
in a generally in a more sensing way, generally in a more thinking way, and generally in a more judging way. So given these pressures of society, perhaps if I hear right what you're saying is that some of these differences, some of these things which are diagnosed as conditions are actually people being themselves, but society's over here and they're over here looking down on them in a way that's not very positive.
That's right, and that's right on track with some of what we were finding with ADHD. And I wasn't looking for this, but I began to see a little bit of trends developing in terms of autism as well. And that is to say, for ADHD, I'll just speak on that. These are going to be folks, what we found, who have um, a very high extroverted intuition coupled with a very low introverted sensing function and a very low extroverted thinking function. Right. So here are
Okay.
the folks, right, who've got this extroverted intuition, they're into ideas, they're into change, they're into exploration, right? But they don't have that grounding of the introverted sensing, which those two usually come together if we talk about type dynamics. But for this ADHD person, this one isn't doing very much at all. And then this thinking function, which can sort of set task in order, right? You have all these ideas. Well, at least let's maybe get to some of them. And this extroverted thinking can be helpful for that. And folks who have a profound deficit in this, coupled with those other two, are the ones who look like or at least endorse symptoms of ADHD.
And I know Young and Myers-Briggs indeed talk about type development and developing all the different parts of your type. And so someone with activated intuition, that's always going to be their primary function,
Oh,
but
yes.
developing the other functions in turn. And from what you're saying is some of these things maybe that extroversion, that extroverted intuition is right up there, but for whatever reason, this person hasn't really developed those other functions in their turn and at their time.
That's right, right. So we see these really, these lower functionings, these lower functions, right, which do serve a purpose in kind of making a person whole and capable and, a functioning member of society. That when they're not doing just a little bit of work, right, to keep that person in some semblance of balance, um, you see that they have this more dynamic or this more extreme kind of personality type, which looks like ADHD.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Now this all sounds. Sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say I'm I'm not sure. Right, this my research does not say, right, that that's the type of thing that could be developed versus this person may be able to develop to a degree, but he or she's always going to have this sort of dominant, extreme personality type. But we can maybe teach them some tools, which, if I'm thinking
Okay.
about it from a clinical sense, that's how we handle it. This person's
Yeah.
going to be like this, but we can get them to be more self aware and we can give them some tools that might be helpful to managing their disorder.
Now, to me, what you're saying, what we're talking about, sounds very reasonable, but clearly it could be traduced in a way that says, let's use the MBTI or let's use this other type of question out there to diagnose conditions in a medical way. Do you feel there's any danger that that sort of thing may happen?
I mean, it shouldn't be the key diagnostic tool. I mean, ultimately, it's going to be the clinicians, going to have the final say. Um,
Yeah.
but I think it's a tool, and I know that some folks, when they put a test out, they kind of want it to have this purpose, and they're kind of hesitant to let it be used in other ways, and I get that. But just in terms of thinking about it, or in terms of folks who are maybe using other instruments, I think it can be helpful. I think it's just a point in a direction. It's just one data point. Um, I sometimes have used the Rorschach, and that's the same thing. It's not going to diagnose the client, and nobody would ever say, even though folks say the Rorschach is a diagnostic tool, you're not going to take your Rorschach results and, copy that and paste it into the client's medical file. You're going to say, well, given what I know about this person and given how they scored on this test, this is what I see going on. And I see the MBTI or any type of function inventory doing that same thing where it says, if I get a client and I'm not really sure what's going on, they're not doing well in school, but they seem really smart or
Yeah.
whatever it is, and I give them this test and it's like, oh, this person's got a lot of extroverted intuition. Let's just start there and
Yeah.
have a conversation. It's not the thing that I'm going to say, oh, sure enough, ADHD.
And I think the MBTI and tools like it are often very, well, really useful for helping people to understand something central about themselves, and that perhaps is the first step on that road, that
Yeah,
self-awareness. Yeah.
absolutely.